The year 1883 baked the high desert until the air itself seemed to crackle. Over Inez Pass, the sun was not a giver of life, but a relentless hammer, beating down with a heat that felt like molten lead. It bleached the color from the sky, leaving a pale, hazy blue that offered no comfort. The wind was its accomplice, a dry, scouring force that picked up the fine alkali dust and sand, whipping it into stinging sheets that could strip a man's hope raw. It hissed through the skeletal remains of yucca plants and moaned around the red rock formations that jutted from the earth like broken teeth. This was a land that demanded resilience and offered little in return but the space to be forgotten. Through this unforgiving landscape, Whit Landry rode. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Dust, moved with a steady, ground-eating pace that spoke of long miles and a shared understanding between rider and beast. The creak and groan of the old leather saddle was a familiar rhythm, a constant companion in the profound silence of his life. Whit sat tall but loose, a man molded by the very terrain he traversed. His face was a map of sun and wind, with the lines etched around his eyes from squinting into countless glaring horizons. A thick, dusty duster, its right shoulder frayed from the rub of a rope, hung from his frame, doing little to ward off the oppressive heat, but protecting him from the sun's merciless glare. He was heading for Broken Spur, the name he'd given his ranch, a name that felt more honest than he cared to admit. He rode with the quiet introspection of a man long accustomed to his own company. His thoughts were practical, focused on the list of worries that were as constant as the northern star, the price of cattle in Copper Bend, the dwindling reserves in his water barrels, the fence line that needed mending along the north pasture. These were the thoughts that kept the deeper, quieter loneliness at bay. It was a silence in his chest, a hollowed-out space that some men filled with whiskey or cards or the hollow laughter of saloon girls. Whit filled it with work. It was the unnatural angle of the thing that first caught his eye, a dark shape, askew in the shimmering heat of a dry arroyo ahead. Not a rock, not a dead animal. It was man-made. He reined Dust to a halt atop a low rise, his hand resting near the worn grip of the Colt Peacemaker holstered on his hip. Caution was a religion in these parts, and a broken-down wagon could just as easily be bait for a trap as it could be a traveler in need. He watched, his eyes narrowed, letting the silence of the desert speak to him. There was no movement, save for the lazy circling of a vulture high above, a patient spectator to all of the desert's small tragedies. After a long moment, he nudged Dust forward, not directly, but in a wide, circling approach that kept him on high ground. As he drew closer, the details sharpened. It was a sturdy wagon, not a flimsy prairie schooner, with solid-looking canvas and lettering on the side. Faded but still legible Union Pacific Railroad Medical Service. One of its rear wheels was canted at a sickening angle. The heavy wooden axle beneath it snapped clean in two. The mule team was unhitched, grazing listlessly on the sparse, tough grass near the edge of the creek bed. Then he saw her, a woman, standing beside the broken wheel, one hand resting on the wagon, her posture rigid with frustration. She wore a simple, practical dress of dark calico, now filmed with a layer of fine dust. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was pinned up, but strands had escaped to whip around her face in the restless wind. She was alone, or so it seemed. Whit's gaze swept the surrounding terrain. The rocks and scrub provided 100 places for a man to hide. His instincts, honed by years of solitude and the quiet dangers of the frontier, screamed that something was wrong. And then he saw them. Two men, crouched behind a cluster of greasewood bushes on the opposite bank of the arroyo. They were low-life scavengers. He could tell by their ragged clothes and the furtive, hungry way they moved, like coyotes sizing up a wounded deer. They carried rifles, held loosely but ready. They hadn't seen him yet, their attention wholly fixed on the woman and her wagon. They were savoring the moment, enjoying her vulnerability before they made their move. The woman, however, seemed to have her own timetable. She kicked the broken wheel, a sharp, angry thud that sent a puff of dust into the air. Wit saw her shoulders square, her head lift, her lips pressed into a thin, determined line. He heard her voice. Not a shout, but a low, guttural sound carried on the wind, a declaration made to herself and the uncaring sky. No more waiting. It was a growl, filled with a weariness that went deeper than a single broken axle on a hot afternoon. It was the sound of a soul pushed to its limit, before Wit could even process the words. She reached back into the wagon and pulled out a long-barreled flintlock pistol. It was an old weapon, a relic, but in her hands, it looked deadly and absolute. She didn't brandish it, she simply raised it, the heavy barrel coming to rest level with her eyes, pointed not at the bandits she hadn't yet seen, but straight ahead, at the hostile world in front of her. She was done being a victim of circumstance. The sight broke the spell of Wit's caution. This was no damsel to be rescued. This was a fighter, cornered and making a stand with the only tools she had. The two bandits rose from their cover, grinning now, their rifles held with a casual menace. They thought her defiance was amusing, a final bit of sport before they took what they wanted. "Well now, looky here, Jeb," one of them called out, his voice greasy with false charm. "Little lady's got some sand in her craw." The woman didn't answer. She just stood there, the pistol held steady, a solitary point of defiance in a vast, indifferent world. Wit didn't think, he acted. He spurred dust forward, the horse leaping down the shallow embankment into the arroyo in a spray of gravel and sand. The sudden movement startled the bandits, their heads whipping around, their grins vanishing. Wit was already uncoiling the lariat from his saddle horn, the rope a familiar extension of his own arm. He swung it once, a wide, perfect loop that sang through the hot air. The woman, Nora James, though he didn't know her name yet, saw him coming, a whirlwind of dust and motion. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, widened for a fraction of a second, not with fear, but with stark surprise. The bandits were fumbling with their rifles, caught off guard by the sudden assault. The rope flew true, settling over her shoulders with a soft hiss. Before she could react, before she could even register the rough fiber against her skin, Wit pulled the slack. He didn't pull gently. It was a sharp, brutal tug, the kind used to bring a 1,000-pound steer to its knees. Nora was lifted from her feet, her breath forced from her lungs in a sharp gasp. She flew backward through the air for a dizzying instant and landed hard on the saddle behind him, her back slamming against his. The flintlock clattered to the ground. Forgotten. "Hold on." Wit's voice was a rough bark, barely audible over the sudden thunder of Dust's hooves. He wheeled the horse, digging his heels in. The buckskin responded instantly, launching them forward like a cannonball. The first shot from the bandits came then, a flat crack that echoed off the canyon walls. The bullet whined past Wit's ear, close enough for him to feel the heat of its passage. Another shot followed, kicking up a plume of sand just behind Dust's flying hooves. They scrambled up the far bank of the arroyo, the horse's powerful muscles straining. They were a single entity of leather, sweat, and desperation. Fleeing from the muzzles of two rifles, Nora's arms had instinctively wrapped around his waist. Her hands clenched tight against his worn shirt. He could feel the rapid, frantic beat of her heart against his back, a wild drumming that seemed to echo the frantic pounding in his own chest. The world became a blur of red rock and thorny scrub. The wind tore at them, trying to rip them from the saddle. Sand and grit flew into their faces, coating their teeth and stinging their eyes. The air was thick with the smell of the horse's sweat, the hot, dusty scent of the earth, the sharp, metallic tang of gun oil from Wit's own pistol, and something else, the faint, clean scent of lye soap and lavender that clung to the woman pressed against him. A bullet struck a rock formation to their left, showering them with stone fragments. Nora flinched but didn't cry out. Her grip tightened, her knuckles pressing into his ribs. Wit urged Dust on, pushing the horse to its limit. He knew this land, every dip and rise, every game trail and hidden path. He veered sharply, guiding the horse into a narrow cut between two mesas, a place where the wind howled and the dust was thickest. It was like riding into a storm. A great, swirling cloud of red dust rose around them. kicked up by the horse's hooves and channeled by the narrow canyon walls. It was a blinding, choking curtain that instantly swallowed them. Behind them, the sounds of the pursuit faltered. The bandits' angry shouts turned to sputtering coughs. Their final, frustrated shot went wide, the bullet thudding harmlessly into the soft earth. They were not trackers, just opportunistic thieves, and they would not follow into that blinding maelstrom. The sounds of their curses and their horses faded, swallowed by the wind and the dust. Whit didn't slow down. He pushed on for another mile, until the narrow cut opened up again into the vast, open plains. Only then did he allow dust to slow, the horse's powerful gallop easing into a steady trot. Then a walk. The buckskin's sides were heaving, its coat dark with sweat. The silence that descended was absolute, broken only by the horse's labored breathing and the rasp of their own. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They remained as they were, a man and a woman, strangers bound together by a rope and a shared flight from violence, their backs pressed together on the cramped space of a single saddle. The dust began to settle on them, a fine red powder that coated their hair and clothes, turning them into statues of the very earth they had fled across. Finally, the woman spoke. Her voice was quiet, a little hoarse from the dust, but steady. "I wasn't waiting for a gentleman," she said, her breath warm against his back. "I was waiting to live." The words struck Whit with a surprising force. He had expected thanks, or perhaps recriminations for the rough handling. He had not expected a simple, profound statement of fact. He thought of her standing there, the old pistol in her hand, a lone figure of defiance. She hadn't been waiting for a hero. She had been preparing to become her own. He gave a single, sharp nod, a gesture she couldn't see but might have felt. "Reckon you were." Something shifted inside him then, in the quiet, hollowed-out space in his chest, a place that had been still and silent for so long. There was a sudden, unfamiliar flutter. It grew stronger, steadier, until it felt like the distant, rhythmic drumming of hoofbeats on hard-packed earth, a sound of something coming, something new. He guided Dust towards a landmark. Only he would recognize a trio of stunted juniper trees that marked the location of an old, abandoned well. They needed water, and he needed to put some distance between the awkward intimacy of the shared saddle and the reality of their situation. He dismounted, his legs feeling stiff, and then turned to help her down. For the first time, they faced each other. Her storm-gray eyes met his, and he saw the intelligence and the fire in them, unquenched by the ordeal. A smudge of dirt streaked her high cheekbone, and her lips were chapped and dusty, but there was an undeniable strength in her face. She was not beautiful in the delicate, fragile way of the women in the mail-order catalogs. But she was handsome, her features carved with a character and purpose that was far more compelling. She placed her hands on his shoulders as he lifted her down, and for a moment, they were close, the heat of the day trapped between them. He released her as if she were a hot coal. She stepped back, smoothing the front of her dusty dress with hands that were surprisingly steady. The silence between them stretched, filled with the unspoken weight of what had just passed. "We'll need to go back for your wagon," Whit said, his voice gruff. "Those varmints will be long gone. We can patch up that axle enough to get it to Copper Bend." She nodded. "My name is Nora James. Whit Landry." They stood there for another second, two solitary figures by a forgotten well in the middle of nowhere. Their eyes met again, a brief, intense connection that was as sharp and surprising as a flash of lightning from a clear sky. In that look, there was a shared acknowledgement of the violence, the fear, and the strange, fierce pulse of life that had thrummed between them on the back of the horse. It was too much, too soon, like two stars passing too close. They veered away, breaking the contact. Nora turned to look at her wagon, a distant speck in the heat haze, and Whit turned to lower the bucket into the cool darkness of the well. The moment was gone, but the echo of it remained, hanging in the hot, still air. The journey back to Copper Bend was a quiet affair, a silent contract of necessity. They splinted the wagon's axle with a length of sturdy ironwood and rope. a rough fix that demanded a slow, jarring pace. They spoke little, the words swallowed by the vastness of the landscape and the lingering tension of the attack. Whit rode ahead, breaking the trail, while Nora handled the mule team with a steady, competent hand. By the time the first dusty, sun-bleached buildings of the town appeared on the horizon, they had exchanged fewer than 100 words, yet a strange, unspoken understanding had settled between them. Copper Bend was not a town that welcomed strangers with open arms. It was a place of closed doors and watchful eyes, a collection of wood and grit held together by commerce and suspicion. The main street was a wide, rutted artery of packed earth that turned to sucking mud in the rain and choking dust in the dry season. It was lined with false-fronted buildings, a general store, a blacksmith, a land office, and 2 saloons that stared at each other from opposite sides of the street like tired old brawlers. Nora secured a room above the Golden Canary, the noisier and therefore cheaper of the 2 saloons. The room was small and smelled of stale beer and old regrets that seeped up through the floorboards. But it had a window that looked out onto the main street, and the proprietor, a weary woman named Martha with kind eyes and a cynical mouth, agreed to let her use a corner of the big, chaotic kitchen downstairs. Within an hour, Nora had transformed the space. She scrubbed a long wooden prep table until it was pale and clean, and laid out her instruments on a fresh linen cloth probes and forceps, needles and suture thread, all gleaming under the light of a kerosene lamp. She arranged her bottles of carbolic acid, iodine, and laudanum in neat rows, creating a small island of sterile order in the heart of the Golden Canary's greasy chaos. She was a woman who built her home wherever she unrolled her medical kit, while Nora established her makeshift infirmary. Whit Landry walked the length of the main street to the one brick building in town, the Copper Bend Bank Land Office. The name was etched in a gold leaf on the glass, and the man behind the polished oak desk was as hard and gleaming as his surroundings. Reeve Caldwell was a man of impeccable attire and chilling stillness. His suit was always perfectly pressed, his hair was slicked back with a precision that defied the dusty environment, and his eyes, the color of a winter sky, missed nothing. He was not a native of this land. He was a predator who had learned to hunt in it. "Landry," Caldwell said, his voice smooth and devoid of warmth. He did not get up. He simply gestured to the chair opposite his desk. Whit did not sit. He remained standing, his dusty duster a stark contrast to the office's pristine order. "Caldwell, came to check the ledger on my note." Caldwell's lips curved into a smile that did not reach his eyes. He opened a heavy, leather-bound book, the pages filled with his elegant, spidery script. He ran a perfectly manicured finger down a column. "Ah, yes, the Landry Ranch, Broken Spur." He savored the name, as if finding a bitter taste in it. "The final payment on the mortgage is due at the start of the grass season. The first good rain, I believe the term's state." "That's right," Whit said, his voice flat. He knew the terms. He lived them every day. "It has been a dry year," Caldwell observed, closing the book with a soft, final thud. "A man could lose everything, waiting for a rain that doesn't come." It was not a threat, merely a statement of fact, delivered with the casual cruelty of a man who held all the cards. "The rain will come," Whit said, more to himself than to Caldwell. He turned and walked out, the soft click of the door closing behind him, feeling like a cell door locking. As he stepped back into the sun-drenched street, he felt the familiar weight of the town's gaze. Men who had known him for years suddenly found something interesting to look at in shop windows. A pair of women, gossiping by the water trough, fell silent as he passed, their eyes following him with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. The whispers followed him like his own shadow. Landry luck. Bad business to get mixed up with a Landry. The story was 3 years old, but in a town like Copper Bend, time did little to dull the edges of a tragedy. The barn fire. It had started late on a moonless night, a flicker that had grown into a raging inferno, consuming the new barn, the winter hay, and a dozen head of prime cattle. But it wasn't the loss of the barn or the stock that had branded him. It was the loss of his younger brother, Eli, who had rushed back inside, convinced one of the horses was still trapped. The roof had collapsed. They had found what was left of him in the morning. The official verdict was a stray lantern spark, but the town had written its own story, a darker, more satisfying narrative filled with whispers of debt, of arguments between brothers, of a man who had been too slow, too scared, or too something else to save his own kin. The rumors had become a wall around Whit, isolating him more effectively than any barbed wire fence. Meanwhile, Nora's corner of the kitchen was seeing its first patient, a young miner named Silas, his face pale under a layer of coal dust, cradled a hand that was swollen and misshapen. He had been careless with a pickaxe, he mumbled, his eyes wide with pain. Nora worked with a calm, efficient grace. She cleaned the wound, her touch gentle but firm, and set the broken fingers with small, expertly fashioned splints. As the laudanum began to dull the sharp edges of his pain, Silas started to talk, his words a low, rambling river of gossip and grievance. "That Caldwell," he muttered, his gaze unfocused. "He's buying up every worthless patch of dirt he can. Anything that touches the survey line for the new railroad spur, paying pennies, tells folks it's cursed land, bad water, but he's buying it all the same." Nora's hands did not stop their work. She wrapped a clean bandage around the splinted fingers, her expression unreadable. "Why would he want worthless land?" she asked, her voice neutral. "Ain't worthless if the railroad needs it for a water stop or a depot." Silas slurred, a flicker of angry awareness in his eyes. "And Caldwell always seems to know what the railroad needs before they do." He looked at his bandaged hand. "Thank you, ma'am. You've got a good touch." The next afternoon, the separate paths of Nora James and Whit Landry crossed again. Whit appeared at the back door of the Golden Canary, a small, terrified Hereford calf in his arms. The calf's left foreleg was caught in the cruel steel jaws of a trap, the metal cutting deep into the flesh. "Found him by the creek," Whit said, his voice low and rough. He wouldn't meet her eyes, his gaze fixed on the suffering animal. "It's not one of mine. The trap! I mean—" Nora's professional calm took over. "Bring him to the table." Together, they lifted the trembling calf. Nora examined the trap. It was a wicked-looking thing, new and well-oiled. She fetched a pair of iron pry bars from her wagon. The work was difficult, requiring all of her strength to work the bars between the powerful springs of the trap. Whit held the calf steady, his large hands surprisingly gentle, murmuring soft, soothing sounds to the frightened animal. Sweat beaded on Nora's forehead, tracing clean paths through the dust on her skin. Finally, with a loud groan of protesting metal, the jaws of the trap sprang open. Nora pulled it away, her hands stained with the calf's warm, dark blood. She cleaned the wound, her fingers probing gently. "It's deep, but the bone isn't broken. He'll be lame for a while, but he'll live." She worked quickly, stitching the torn flesh with neat, precise sutures. Whit watched her, his silence a palpable thing in the busy kitchen. He watched the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the steady competence of her hands, the way she treated the small, insignificant animal with the same focused care she had shown the miner. That Sunday, the whole of Copper Bend gathered at the church, a simple wooden structure that also served as the town hall and courthouse. Reverend Ames, a thin man with a passionate voice, was trying to raise funds to build a proper clinic. "Miss James has shown us the desperate need," he proclaimed, his gaze sweeping over the congregation. "She works out of the back of a saloon. It is our Christian duty to provide a decent place for the healing of the sick and injured." A collection plate was passed. When it reached Reeve Caldwell, he dropped a single silver dollar onto it with a theatrical clink. He looked across the aisle, his gaze landing on Nora, and offered her that same thin, cold smile. It was a gesture of public charity that felt more like an insult. After the service, as people milled about in the churchyard, Whit approached Nora. He held out a small, folded piece of linen. "You dropped this. he said, pressing it into her hand. "On the ride from the arroyo." It was a handkerchief, finely made, now clean and neatly pressed. In the corner, a small, elegant monogram was stitched in dark blue thread, D.U.J. The fabric was soft and cool against her skin. She remembered dropping it, remembered the frantic scramble. He had kept it all this time. The simple gesture felt impossibly intimate in the public glare of the churchyard. A blush rose on her cheeks, a heat that had nothing to do with the sun. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The embroidered letters seemed to tremble in her hand. That night, Copper Ben settled into an uneasy sleep. The distant, mournful wail of a train whistle cut through the darkness, a reminder of the world that lay beyond the town's claustrophobic horizons. The sound was a lonely cry that seemed to pull a long, collective sigh from the sleeping town. In her small room above the saloon, Nora lit a lamp. She opened a leather-bound journal and dipped a pen into a bottle of ink. The sounds from downstairs, a burst of raucous laughter. The tinny, out-of-tune notes of the piano faded into the background. She wrote, her script firm and clear, October 12th, 1883. "The work is hard. The need is great. This town holds its breath, waiting for something to happen. I will not. No more waiting, not even for the heart. Miles away, at the Broken Spur Ranch, Whit Landry sat on the porch of his small, sturdy cabin. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of dust and sage. Before him, stark against the star-dusted sky, was the skeleton of the burned-out barn. The charred timbers stood like accusing fingers pointing at the heavens. He didn't need a fire to see the ghosts. He could hear the crackle of the flames, smell the acrid smoke, feel the searing heat on his face. He could hear Eli's voice, shouting something about the horses. And then, nothing. Just the roar of the fire and the terrible, final crash of the roof. A breeze picked up, whispering through the ruins. It stirred the old ache in his right shoulder, where a falling beam had left a long, puckered scar. The scar was a permanent reminder, a physical manifestation of his failure. It always hurt more when the wind blew from the north, as if carrying the whispers from the town. He looked at the pile of ash and twisted timber, the place where his life had broken in two. He had been living in the shadow of that fire for 3 years, a ghost on his own land. High above, a hawk sliced through the night sky, a dark, silent shape against the moon. It circled once, then soared away, riding the wind currents with an effortless mastery. Whit watched it go. He thought of the trap he'd found on the calf's leg, new and well-oiled. He thought of Reeve Caldwell's cold eyes and Silas the miner's rambling words about the railroad. A slow, cold anger began to burn in his gut, a fire of a different kind. He realized, with a clarity that was as sharp and clean as the desert air, that he had a choice. He could stay here on this porch, forever defined by the ashes of his past, or he could be like the hawk. He had to fly, or he would be nothing more than the fire's shadow for the rest of his life. The memory came unbidden, triggered by the simple act of banking the embers in his cabin's small cast-iron stove. The scent of hot metal and wood smoke, usually a comfort in the cool desert evenings, was suddenly the smell of ash and ruin. The quiet hiss of the dying fire became a roar. 3 years ago, the world had been made of fire and screaming. Not his screams, or even Eli's. The screams of the cattle, a terrible, guttural sound of pure animal terror that ripped through the night. The heat was a physical blow, pushing him back, stealing the air from his lungs. Smoke, thick and black and greasy, poured from the barn, a foul breath from the mouth of hell. He had been outside, checking a loose hinge on the corral gate, when the first tongue of orange flame had licked through the roof. He remembered shouting for Eli, his voice thin and useless against the fire's roar. His younger brother had burst from the cabin, his face stark white in the flickering, hellish light. The horses Eli had screamed, his eyes wide with a desperate, foolish bravery. Sundance is still in his stall, no? Eli, it's too late. Whit had grabbed for his brother's arm. But Eli was faster, younger, and fueled by an adrenaline Whit's own body, frozen in shock, could not muster. He had watched, paralyzed, as Eli tied a wet bandana over his face and plunged into the churning smoke at the massive barn door. For a moment, Whit's feet were rooted to the ground, his mind a blank wall of disbelief and a primal, paralyzing fear. He was the older brother. He was supposed to be the responsible one, the one who protected. But in that moment, he was just a man watching a fire eat his world. The moment of hesitation lasted an eternity. When he finally broke from his trance and ran toward the barn, it was to the sound of a great groaning crack of timber. The roof gave way, collapsing inward in a volcanic eruption of sparks and flame. The sound was absolute, a final, deafening punctuation mark. And then there was only the roar of the fire and the awful, continued screaming of the burning cattle. He had stood there, his face blistered by the heat, his lungs raw, and listened as his life burned to the ground. People in Copper Bend had called it a tragedy, another chapter in the hard-luck saga of the Landry family, the Landry fate. They called it a curse that had followed the family from the rocky farms of Missouri to the unforgiving dust of the West. They spoke of it with a somber, almost satisfied shake of their heads. But Whit knew the truth. In the silent, unforgiving courtroom of his own mind, there was no fate. There was no curse. He called it by its real name, my fault. The sharp sting of a splinter from the firewood in his hand pulled him back to the present. He was standing by his stove, his knuckles white, his heart hammering against his ribs as if he had just run a mile. The memory had left him shaking, slick with a cold sweat that had nothing to do with the cabin's temperature. He threw the last log into the stove with a clatter and stepped outside, needing the vast, indifferent emptiness of the night to breathe. The next morning, he rode out to check the north fence line, the one that bordered a stretch of unclaimed territory leading towards the red clay hills. It was a routine task, a way to fill the hours with physical work that kept the ghosts at bay. That's when he found it. 3 strands of good barbed wire, snipped clean through as if by a giant's shears. This was no rustler's work. Rustlers were lazy. They'd break a post or pull the staples. They wouldn't take the time to cut so neatly. This was deliberate. His eyes scanned the ground, and there, pressed into the dry, dusty soil, were the tracks, wagon tracks. But they weren't the narrow ruts of a buckboard or a farm wagon. These were wider, deeper, the kind left by a heavy freight wagon. Frowning, he dismounted and followed them. They didn't lead towards his pastures. They ran parallel to his fence line for a quarter mile, then veered away, heading directly for the distant, reddish smudge of Caldwell's clay mine. A cold knot formed in his stomach. It made no sense. There was nothing out here for a freight wagon but rock and scrub. Later that day, he found himself outside the Golden Canary, the steel trap they had removed from the calf in his hand. He'd told himself he was going to see the blacksmith, to ask if he recognized the make, but his feet had carried him to the saloon's back door instead. He found Nora grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle, the sharp, clean scent of mint and yarrow cutting through the kitchen smell of stale grease. He placed the trap on her table. "I thought you might want to look at this," he said, the words coming out more gruffly than he intended. "Before I get rid of it." She wiped her hands on her apron and picked it up, her examination as thorough and detached as if it were a fractured bone. She studied the mechanism, the strength of the spring, the cruel teeth. Then she brought it closer to her face, her brow furrowed. She sniffed it once, then again, her nose close to the oily hinge. "This isn't right," she said, her voice quiet with concentration. "What do you mean?" "The smell. Trappers use pine tar or animal fat to cover their scent and protect the metal." She looked up at him, her gray eyes sharp and clear. "This smells of kerosene." Whit felt the cold knot in his stomach tighten. Kerosene. Not the scent of a poacher, but the scent of an arsonist. It was the same accelerant that had turned his barn into an inferno in minutes. Nora saw the look on his face, the sudden pallor beneath his sun-darkened skin. She set the trap down gently. She took out her small, leather-bound journal and a pencil. She began to write. her script neat and precise, a stark contrast to the turbulent thoughts crashing through Whit's mind. She noted the date, the location where the trap was found, its unusual construction, and the distinct smell of kerosene. She was not a nurse in that moment. She was a coroner, cataloging the evidence of a crime. The sight of her methodical documentation, her calm pursuit of facts, was both unnerving and strangely comforting. The tracks from a heavy wagon were near it. He heard himself say, "They led toward Caldwell's mine." She stopped writing and looked at him, her expression serious. "You have to tell the marshal." Whit laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Marshal Davis. He's in Caldwell's pocket. He'll write it up as a prank, and that will be the end of it. No, the best thing to do is nothing. Fix the fence. Be more watchful. I have a herd to think about. I can't afford to make enemies." He was thinking of the note at the bank, the payment due when the rains came. He was thinking of how easily a man like Caldwell could crush him. Nora closed her journal. The sound, a soft slap in the quiet kitchen. She faced him, her stance unwavering. "And what about the next fire? Whit, or the next trap? Will you just keep fixing the fences and hoping for the best?" "It's my problem," he insisted, his voice tight. "Not yours." "Is it?" she challenged, her voice rising with a quiet fire. "A man is buying up land with threats and sabotage. Children play in these hills. What if it had been a child that stepped in that trap instead of a calf? Doing nothing is a choice. Silence feeds the wicked. It lets them grow bolder." Her words hit him harder than any physical blow. Silence feeds the wicked. He had been silent for 3 years about his own part in Eli's death, a silence that had fed his guilt until it had grown into a monster. He looked at Nora, at the fierce conviction in her eyes, and felt a profound, shameful weariness with his own caution. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. The question, a surrender. "Help me," she said simply. "Those tracks will still be there. We follow them, tonight. We see where they lead." The agreement was made with a simple nod. He was to come back after moonrise. When he returned, the kitchen was quiet, the lamps turned down low. The sounds of the saloon upstairs were muffled, a distant, boisterous ghost. Nora was waiting for him, a small cloth bag of supplies at her feet. "Before we go," she said, her voice softer now, "your shoulder, I saw you favoring it at the church. Let me look." Before he could protest, she gestured to a stool. He sat, his back to her, and reluctantly pulled his shirt off. The night air was cool on his skin. He heard the small clink of a glass jar being opened. He smelled the sharp, clean scent of arnica and wintergreen. "The fire," she stated. It was not a question. He just nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He felt the touch of her fingers, gentle and cool, tracing the edge of the scar. It was a long, ugly thing, a permanent welt of raised, discolored skin. No one had touched it in 3 years. No one had been close enough. Then came the salve. It was cool at first. Then a slow, penetrating heat began to spread through the old, deadened nerves. The warmth was a strange, shocking sensation in tissue that had long felt numb. He flinched, a sharp, involuntary jerk of his muscles, a gasp of breath. "Did I hurt you?" she asked quickly, her hands pulling back. "No," he managed to say, his voice hoarse. It's been a long time since it felt anything." He turned on the stool to face her. She was closer than he had realized. He could see the faint dusting of freckles across her nose, the way the lamplight caught the gold flecks in her gray eyes. Her hand was still raised, her fingers glistening with the ointment. The scent of her, clean soap and herbs, filled the small space between them, and their eyes met. It was more than a look. It was a collision. In that shared gaze, he saw not pity, but understanding. He saw the fire in her, the same resolute spirit that had raised a pistol against impossible odds. She saw in his eyes not the town's caricature of a cursed, broken man, but the deep, aching guilt of a brother who believed he had failed. The air grew thick, charged with all the things they had not said. He saw her lips part slightly. He felt an undeniable pull, a magnetic force drawing him forward. The urge to close the small distance between them was overwhelming. A sudden patter of rain against the window pane broke the spell. It was a soft, hesitant sound, the first drops of a coming storm. Far out on the plains, a lone wolf howled, a long, mournful cry that spoke of hunger and solitude. From the stove in the corner of the kitchen, the gentle, rhythmic bubbling of a pot of beans was the only other sound, a homey, comforting murmur against the vast, wild darkness outside. The moment was broken, the fragile tension shattered. Nora lowered her hand and stepped back. Her cheeks flushed. Whit looked away, towards the rain-streaked window, his heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm. The door to the saloon kitchen was closed, shutting them into this small, quiet space. But a question, vast and dangerous, had just been opened between them, hanging in the air like the scent of the coming rain. Was it possible that the fire that had defined his past, the one he had always called an accident, was not an accident at all? The rain had been a liar, a mere dusting that did little more than settle the dust and leave the air heavy with the pregnant scent of wet earth and creosote. Now, hours later, the clouds had broken and scattered. The sky was a vast, bottomless expanse of black velvet, so dark that the stars looked like chips of ice, sharp and painfully bright. There was no moon. It was a perfect night for secrets. They rode as one shadow, a single, dark shape moving through a landscape of deeper shadows. Whit had extinguished their only lantern miles back. Trusting Dust's night vision and his own intimate knowledge of the terrain, the horse moved with a sure-footed silence that was unnerving, a ghost gliding over the dark land. Nora sat behind Whit, her hands resting lightly on his hips, her body's warmth a small, solid presence against the vast, cool emptiness of the night. The forced intimacy of the shared saddle was no longer awkward. It had become a necessity, a silent pact of trust. Every shift of his weight, every subtle command he gave the horse through the pressure of his knees, she felt and moved with him. They followed the faint wagon tracks not by sight, but by a kind of sixth sense, reading the slight depressions in the land. The trail led them away from the open plains and into the broken, rugged country that formed the foothills of the Dragoon Mountains. The air grew cooler, the silence more profound. Here, the only sounds were the soft thud of Dust's hooves on the sandy soil and the whisper of the night breeze through the skeletal arms of saguaro cacti. Whit reined the horse to a halt in a thicket of mesquite that offered deep cover. Ahead, nestled in a small, boxy canyon, was a flicker of light, the dim, orange glow of a campfire. It was a careless light, a sign of men who believed themselves to be alone and unassailable. Whit slid from the saddle, his boots making no sound on the soft ground. He turned and held up his arms, and Nora came down easily into them. For a moment, they stood close in the darkness, his hands still on her waist. "Stay with the horse," he whispered, his voice a low rumble. "No," she whispered back, her voice fierce and absolute. "We do this together." He saw the stubborn set of her jaw in the faint starlight and knew it was useless to argue. He gave a sharp, reluctant nod. They moved forward on foot, flitting from one pool of shadow to the next, their movements synchronized by a shared sense of purpose and danger. The camp was a crude affair, set up near the dark, gaping maw of a mine at it. A single freight wagon, its canvas cover stained and dark, stood nearby. Two men were hunkered by the fire, their faces brutish and dull in the flickering light. A third man patrolled the perimeter, a rifle cradled in his arms. He walked with a lazy, confident swagger, his spurs jingling softly with each step. As he passed a point where the firelight caught him fully, Nora's fingers tightened on Whit's arm. She pointed, her gesture small and sharp. His boots. Whit followed her gaze. The guard's boots, caked with mud, had a distinct, rusty red color. It was the same unique, iron-rich clay that came from Caldwell's mine, the same clay that stained the creek beds for miles around it. It was a detail no one would notice unless they were looking for it. Caldwell's mine dirt. She breathed, the words barely audible. It was their first concrete link. They waited, their patience a tangible thing. As the guard completed his circuit and moved to the far side of the camp, now was their chance. Whit led the way, not towards the men, but towards the freight wagon, which stood in the deepest shadows away from the fire. The canvas flap at the back was untied. Whit lifted a corner, the rough material scraping softly against his calloused hand, and they slipped inside. The air within was close and smelled of oil, metal, and dust. Their eyes slowly adjusted to the gloom. It was a mobile storehouse of sabotage. Stacked against one wall were several barrels. Nora ran a finger along the rim of one and then brought it to her nose. "Kerosene," she confirmed in a whisper. Next to the barrels was a coil of new, gleaming wire, identical to the kind used in the trap, and beside that, a long, two-man handsaw, its teeth freshly sharpened. It was a kit for creating chaos, for setting fires and crippling livestock. And then Whit saw it, a small, battered wooden crate tucked under a pile of burlap sacks. He carefully lifted the lid. Inside was a mess of papers, but on top lay a small, leather-bound ledger. He picked it up, his thumb smudging the dust on the cover. He opened it. Inside, columns of names were listed next to dates and figures. It was a payroll book, and on the front page, under the heading "Wages Paid for Contracted Services," was a signature, written in a bold, arrogant script that Whit recognized from the bank. C. Reeve. He felt a surge of triumph, cold and sharp. This was it. This was the proof that could burn Caldwell's empire to the ground. He was about to slip the ledger under his shirt when Nora touched his arm again. She was holding up a piece of paper, a single receipt. It was a bill of sale for 20 barrels of kerosene and 3 coils of steel wire, made out to Reeve Caldwell, and marked as paid. She had found it tucked into the ledger. It was then that they heard it, the sound of approaching hoofbeats, moving at a fast clip, not the lazy walk of the patrolling guard, but the purposeful trot of a rider. The men outside the wagon fell silent. "Someone's coming," one of them grunted. There was no time to get out of the wagon, no time to run. Whit's instincts took over. He grabbed Nora's hand and pulled her toward the back of the wagon. "Out, now," he breathed. They slipped back into the darkness just as the new rider entered the ring of firelight. But they were exposed, with 100 yards of open, moonlit ground between them and the safety of the mesquite grove. Down, Whit hissed. He pulled Nora with him, tumbling into a shallow, dry wash at the edge of the camp, a mere depression in the earth that offered the barest of cover. They landed hard in the loose sand and gravel, Whit instinctively cushioning her fall with his own body. He rolled, pulling her tight against him, his hand coming up to cover her mouth to stifle any sound she might make. They lay pressed together in the narrow ditch, the world shrinking to the sound of their own frantic breathing and the pounding of their hearts. The new rider dismounted. His boots crunched on the gravel not 10 feet from where they lay hidden. He was big, a mountain of a man, and he spoke with an authority that made the other 3 guards straighten up. They couldn't make out the words, just the low, angry murmur of his voice. He was giving orders. Then, one of the original guards walked toward them. His shadow fell over their hiding place first, a long, dark shape that blotted out the stars. He stopped directly on the bank above them, so close Whit could have reached out and touched the worn heel of his boot. They froze, every muscle tensed. Whit could feel the frantic pulse in Nora's throat beneath his palm. He felt her hot, sharp breaths against the skin of his neck. The guard hawked and spat, a thick glob of tobacco juice landing in the dirt with a wet smack. Less than an inch from the brim of Nora's hat, she flinched beneath him, a violent, suppressed shudder, but made no sound. The man stood there for what felt like a lifetime, scratching his neck, his leather gear creaking. Then, mercifully, he turned and walked back toward the fire. They didn't dare move until they heard the new rider mount his horse. He gave one last set of barked orders, then spurred his horse and galloped away, his hoofbeats fading back into the night. Now the camp was stirring. The guards were dousing the fire, getting ready to move. "We have to go," Whit breathed, his mouth close to her ear. "When I say," they watched as the last guard saddled his horse and turned to follow the wagon. The moment his back was turned, The moment the horse's tail swung out of view, Wit moved. Now, they didn't run for the safety of the trees. They ran back to the wagon. In the chaotic moments of the camp breaking up, it was the last place the guards would expect them to be. Nora, her mind sharp and clear despite the terror, snatched up the piece of oil-soaked burlap they had seen inside. While Wit grabbed the ledger, they had their proof. Just as they turned to flee, a sharp, clanging sound split the night. A mine bell. Someone must have spotted their movement. A shout went up. The game was over. There was no time for a proper mount. Wit threw the ledger and the cloth onto the saddle, then grabbed Nora around the waist, lifting her clean off the ground. With a powerful heave, he swung her up and over the horse's neck, depositing her unceremoniously onto the saddle. He vaulted up behind her just as the first gunshot cracked through the air. He dug his heels into Dust's sides, and the horse exploded into a full gallop. They plunged down the side of a steep, sandy arroyo, a move so reckless it was their only chance. Sand and rocks sprayed from Dust's churning hooves. A bullet whizzed past Wit's head, and another slammed into a tall yucca plant beside them. The impact sent out a shower of strange, ethereal green sparks that lit the darkness for a split second. Nora didn't scream. She bit her lower lip, hard enough to taste blood, and wrapped her arms around Wit's waist, her body a shield for the precious ledger tucked between them. She held on with a strength that surprised him, her body moving with his, with the horse, a seamless part of their desperate flight. Amidst the chaos, the thunder of hooves, the rasp of his own breathing, the continued crack of rifles behind them, he was suddenly aware of something else, the beat of her heart against his back. It wasn't the frantic, panicked fluttering he would have expected. It was a strong, steady, powerful rhythm, a beat as constant and relentless as the gallop of the horse carrying them to safety. It was the heart of a fighter. They rode like the devil himself was on their tail, not slowing until the sounds of pursuit had completely faded, until the Box Canyon was miles behind them. Only then did Wit allow Dust to slow to a trot, the horse's sides heaving, its coat slick with sweat. They found a small, sheltered cove, hidden by a cluster of massive boulders, and finally dismounted. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was deafening. For a long moment, they just stood there, catching their breath, the adrenaline slowly beginning to recede, leaving them shaky and exhausted. They had done it. They had the proof. And then, carried on the thin, cool night wind from the direction they had just fled, came a faint sound. It was the sound of a man's laughter, a harsh, triumphant sound, full of cruel amusement. It was the laughter of someone who had enjoyed the chase, the laughter of a predator who was not worried, who knew that the game was far from over. The night swallowed the sound, but it lingered in the air, a chilling promise of the violence yet to come. Dawn broke over Copper Bend not with a gentle blush, but with a hard, brassy glare that promised another day of searing heat. The town was already awake, its lifeblood converging on the sprawling collection of pens and corrals at the east end of the main street, the weekly cattle market. The air was thick with the smells of dust, manure, and nervous livestock, a potent perfume of commerce and survival. The sounds were a chaotic symphony, the bawling of cattle, the sharp whistles of drovers, the rhythmic chant of an auctioneer warming up his voice, and the constant murmur of men haggling over prices. This was the town's true courthouse, where fortunes were made or broken not with a gavel, but with a handshake and a bill of sale. In the center of this swirling activity, a space had been cleared. A heavy oak table and 2 chairs served as the makeshift bench for Judge Lucy Harrow. She was a woman who seemed carved from the same unyielding ironwood as the gavel she rarely used. Her face was a roadmap of her years on the frontier, her skin tanned to the color of old leather, and her eyes, a pale, piercing blue, had a way of stripping a man of his pretenses. She wore a man's riding coat over a simple calico dress, a practical attire for a woman who dispensed justice from a saddle as often as from a bench. A hush fell over the immediate crowd as Nora James approached the table. She moved with a quiet, determined grace. Whit Landry, a half-step behind her, his presence a solid, looming shadow. She was not intimidated by the sea of rough, curious faces. She placed the oil-soaked burlap in Caldwell's ledger on the table. The items looked stark and out of place amidst the market's ordinary business. "Judge Harrow." Nora's voice was clear and steady, cutting through the morning din. "We have evidence of criminal activity, sabotage, conspiracy to commit arson, and endangerment of the community. It all leads back to Reeve Caldwell and his mining operation." Judge Harrow's gaze shifted from Nora's unwavering face to the evidence. She picked up the ledger with her gnarled, surprisingly strong hands, her expression unreadable. She turned the pages slowly, her sharp eyes scanning the neat columns of figures and the arrogant signature on the frontispiece. A low, dangerous murmur rippled through the assembled ranchers and townsfolk. The crowd parted as Reeve Caldwell himself appeared. He moved with his usual reptilian grace, impeccably dressed, a calm island in the dusty, chaotic sea. He was flanked by two broad-shouldered men who looked more like hired muscle than bank clerks. He did not look at the evidence. He did not look at Nora. He looked directly at Judge Harrow, a faint, condescending smile playing on his lips. "Your Honor," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "These are serious and, frankly, wild accusations from a woman of recent acquaintance to our town, and a man of known misfortune." He let the insult hang in the air, his gaze flicking to Wit for just a moment. Then, he produced a folded sheaf of papers from his inner coat pocket. He laid it on the table, not touching the ledger, but placing it beside it as an equal. "What I have, on the other hand, is not a book of unsubstantiated claims, but a legal document, a mortgage note for the Broken Spur Ranch, held by this bank." He tapped the paper with a single, manicured finger. His eyes found Wit in the crowd, cold and possessive. "The terms are clear. Come the grass season. If Mr. Landry is late with his payment, I take the land." The message was clear. A public execution of Wit's reputation and finances. Caldwell was reminding everyone who held the real power in Copper Bend. The whispers in the crowd shifted, the suspicion now mixed with a grudging respect for Caldwell's audacity and a renewed pity for Wit. Judge Harrow looked from the ledger to the mortgage note. She closed the ledger with a soft thud. "These are serious charges, Mr. Caldwell, and this is serious evidence." She fixed him with her piercing gaze. "I am granting a period of 3 days for the territorial marshal to come and verify the authenticity of this ledger and the signature within it. In the meantime, I am issuing a temporary injunction. Your mine is to be sealed. No one goes in, nothing comes out." A collective gasp went through the crowd. It was a bold move, a direct challenge to Caldwell's authority. For the first time, a flicker of something other than cool amusement crossed Caldwell's face. It was a brief flash of irritation, quickly suppressed. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Across the square, one of his men, a lanky drover with mean eyes, nodded back. Caldwell then inclined his head toward Judge Harrow. "As you wish, Your Honor. The law, after all, must be seen to be served." His smile returned, thin and sharp. He had lost the first round, but the day was far from over. The afternoon sun beat down on the auction pens, the heat radiating in shimmering waves from the packed, dusty earth. The real business of the day began, the auctioneer's rhythmic, hypnotic chant echoing through the corrals. When the lot from the Broken Spur Ranch was driven into the pen, 20 head of fine, healthy yearlings, a strange lethargy fell over the buyers. The auctioneer began his call. "What am I bid for this prime lot? Gentlemen, look at the health on 'em. Let's start the bidding at $10 a head. Do I hear 10 silence?" The buyers, men who minutes before had been bidding fiercely, now studied their boots, adjusted their hats, and avoided the auctioneer's pleading gaze. From the edge of the crowd, Reeve Caldwell watched, his arms crossed, his expression placid. The buyers would glance at him, a quick, furtive look, and he would give no sign. His stillness a more potent command than any word. $9. Then the auctioneer pleaded, his face slick with sweat. "Gentlemen, this is robbery 8. Wit stood by the fence, his hands gripping the top rail until his knuckles were white. He felt 100 pairs of eyes on him, a heavy weight of humiliation and pity. He was being financially strangled in broad daylight, and everyone was watching. This was Caldwell's true power, not just in contracts and ledgers, but in his ability to command fear and compliance without saying a word. Just as the auctioneer was about to give up, a new kind of activity began at the far end of the pens. Nora James appeared, leading a small, thirsty-looking calf. Behind her trailed a half-dozen of the miners' children, their faces smudged with dirt, but their eyes bright with excitement. Nora led the calf to a water trough, and the children giggled as it drank greedily. Then, she produced a bucket and a stool and began to milk one of Whit's heifers that had been separated for sale. "Fresh milk," she called out, her voice carrying a warmth and cheer that cut through the tense atmosphere. "A penny a cup. All proceeds to the new town clinic." It was a brilliant, unexpected maneuver. At first, only the miners' wives, emboldened by loyalty to the woman who had tended their husbands' wounds, came forward. They clucked over the calves and handed Nora their pennies. Then, seeing the act of quiet defiance, others began to join. The blacksmith's wife, then old Farmer McGregor, then a few of the drovers who had no love for Caldwell. Soon, a small, steady line had formed, a quiet rebellion taking shape around a bucket of milk. They weren't just buying milk, they were casting a vote. Caldwell watched the scene, his jaw tight. His public strangulation of Whit Landry was being turned into a community fundraiser inside the pen. Whit worked, his body a tight coil of controlled fury. He moved among the nervous cattle, his presence calming them, his shoulder pushing a straying calf back into the herd. He was oblivious to the drama of the milk buying. His world had shrunk to the heat, the dust, and the physical reality of his animals. Sweat poured from him, dripping from his chin onto the dusty ground, leaving small, dark circles that quickly evaporated. It ran down his back, plastering his shirt to his skin. He pushed his back against the flank of a large steer, holding the herd steady, the muscles in his legs and back straining with the effort. He was a man holding his world together with his bare hands. The auction was a lost cause, but the small acts of support had shifted the mood of the crowd. Caldwell could feel the tide turning against him. He gave another signal, a sharp, angry jerk of his head. A man Whit had never seen before, a stranger with a gunslinger's swagger and cold, dead eyes, stepped away from the saloon. He drew a pistol with a lazy, deliberate motion, pointed it at the sky, and fired. The gunshot was a violent explosion that shattered the afternoon. The crowd screamed and scattered, a panicked wave of humanity. Horses reared, and the cattle in the pen began to stampede, their eyes white with terror. The line for milk dissolved as mothers grabbed their children and ran for cover. In the ensuing chaos, Nora did not run. She reached into the medical bag at her hip and pulled out a heavy, brass railroad whistle. She put it to her lips and blew. The sound was not a gunshot, but it was just as shocking a piercing, ear-splitting shriek that cut through the panic like a surgeon's scalpel. It was a sound of emergency, of order, a demand to be heard over the fear. The gunman, startled by the noise, turned toward Nora. That was the only opening Whit needed. He launched himself over the fence of the corral, his exhaustion replaced by a surge of pure, protective rage. He hit the gunman with the force of a charging bull, a tackle that drove the man backward several steps. They crashed hard against the thick, weathered rope that ran from the ground up to the bell in the small steeple of the adjacent church. The impact sent a deep, shuddering bong across the town square. They wrestled, their bodies slamming against the rope again and again. Bong, bong, bong. The frantic, discordant tolling of the church bell was like the thunder of a coming storm, an alarm that spoke of violence and a reckoning. Whit, fueled by a righteous fury, drove his fist into the gunman's jaw. The man went limp, slumping to the ground. Silence descended, broken only by the last, dying echo of the bell. The townsfolk slowly emerged from their hiding places, their faces a mixture of fear and awe. Whit stood over the unconscious gunman, his chest heaving, his fists clenched, his face a mask of grim determination. Reeve Caldwell had not moved. He watched the scene with a look of cold, detached assessment. He pushed himself off the post he had been leaning against and walked calmly into the center of the square, stopping a few feet from where Nora was helping Whit to his feet. He gave a dry, humorless half-smile. A valiant effort. Landry, but brawling in the street changes nothing. His gaze shifted to Nora, his eyes glittering with malice. The law is a matter of paperwork. It sides with the man holding the paper. Nora met his gaze without flinching. She stood beside Whit, her hand resting on his arm. A small gesture of solidarity that was as powerful as a fortress wall. "And the truth," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with the clarity of the church bell. The aftermath of the confrontation at the cattle market left a simmering, metallic taste in the air of Copper Bend. There was no victory, only a temporary truce dictated by Judge Harrow's 3-day deadline. As twilight bled across the sky, painting the clouds in bruised shades of purple and orange, Whit and Nora knew they couldn't stay in town. The ledger, now their shield and their burden, made them a target. They had to get back to the Broken Spur, to the relative safety of Whit's isolated land. But the open road was a dangerous place for people who had just publicly challenged Reeve Caldwell. They left under the cover of the deepest darkness, pushing dust hard, the single horse a testament to their shared risk. The night was unnervingly still until the moon began to rise. It was a bloated, unnerving orb, climbing over the jagged black silhouette of the mountains, its light not the familiar silver of a harvest moon, but a dull, rusty red, as if the celestial body itself were bleeding. A blood moon. It cast the landscape in a sickly, crimson glow, turning the familiar rocks and cacti into alien shapes. A sudden wind kicked up, howling through the canyons, carrying the rich, heavy smell of damp earth from the earlier rain and the promise of more to come. Ahead of them, spanning the deep, shadowy gash of the Arroyo Seco, was the bridge. It was a long, rickety structure of weathered wood and rope, a testament to optimistic engineering and constant repair. As they approached, the wind tore at the loose planks, making the entire bridge moan and creak like a great beast in pain. It was the only crossing for 10 miles in either direction. It was a choke point. It was a trap. They saw the riders just as Dust's hooves hit the first wooden planks. They emerged from the deep shadows on the far side of the arroyo. 4 dark figures on horseback, fanning out to block the exit. They were patient silhouettes against the malevolent red moon. Waiting. There was no time for words, no time for a plan. Nora's hand instinctively went to her coat, her fingers pressing against the hard, rectangular shape of the ledger tucked inside. It was the heart of their hope and the reason for this ambush. Whit saw the movement, saw the resolve in her eyes in the dim, red light. He leaned forward, his mouth close to her ear, his voice a low, urgent command against the wind. "Hold tight." He dug his heels into Dust's flanks. The horse, sensing the rider's desperate urgency, leaped forward, abandoning its cautious pace for a full, thundering gallop. The world dissolved into a blur of motion and a deafening clatter of hooves on wood. The bridge swayed violently beneath them, a frantic dance over the black emptiness of the arroyo. The first gunshot cracked, the sound shockingly loud. A bullet whined past Nora's ear. Another followed, then a volley. Splinters erupted from the wooden railing beside them. The air was filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. A bullet struck a post just ahead of Nora's face, and a sliver of wood, long and sharp as a needle, flew back, slicing her cheek. She cried out, a sharp intake of breath. The pain, a sudden, hot sting. She could feel a thin line of warmth trickling down her skin. They were halfway across. The riders were closing the distance, their own horses now pounding onto the bridge. Whit knew they would never make it to the other side. He had one chance, a desperate gamble based on his knowledge of this old bridge's weaknesses. He pulled his hunting knife, its blade gleaming in the red moonlight. Reaching out, he leaned precariously from the saddle, ignoring the bullets that sang around him. He slashed at one of the thick, auxiliary support ropes that ran along the side of the bridge, a rope meant to provide stability. A rope he now prayed was as rotten as it looked. The knife bit deep. The old hemp fibers, strained by the wind and the galloping horses, began to unravel with a series of sharp, snapping sounds. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, with a great, groaning shriek of tortured timber, the rope snapped. The tension on their half of the bridge gave way. The planks beneath the pursuing riders buckled and collapsed, falling away into the darkness of the arroyo like a massive trapdoor springing open. Horses screamed. Men shouted in terror and rage as the back half of the bridge disintegrated, leaving a yawning, impassable chasm. They were safe. For a moment, one of the riders, more agile and more desperate than the rest, had spurred his horse into a great leap just as the bridge gave way. The horse landed hard, its legs buckling, throwing its rider, but he had made it across the gap. The man rolled and came up with a long, wicked-looking knife in his hand. He charged at them, his face a mask of fury in the crimson light. Whit raised his Colt to fire, but as he looked at the man rushing towards them, a face contorted with rage, framed by fire-red light. His mind betrayed him. The image dissolved, replaced by the memory of the barn fire, the roaring flames, the collapsing roof. He saw his brother, Eli, a face full of foolish, desperate bravery, plunging into the smoke. The weight of his failure, the guilt he carried every second of every day, crashed down on him. A physical blow. His hand faltered. The world went silent, save for the roaring in his ears. He was frozen. A ghost haunted in the middle of a fight for his life. "Whit, look at me." Nora's voice cut through the fog of his memory. A sharp, commanding anchor in the chaotic present. He blinked, and the burning barn was gone, replaced by the glint of the approaching knife. In that same instant, Nora acted. She thrust her hand into a small pouch on her belt and threw its contents in a single, fluid motion. A small cloud of sand and grit flew through the air and struck the attacker square in the face. The man roared in pain and surprise, his hands flying to his eyes. The knife clattered to the wooden planks. That was all the time Whit needed. The ghost of the past was banished, replaced by a cold, present fury. He didn't fire the gun. He reversed it in his hand and lunged forward, swinging the heavy barrel of the Colt in a brutal arc. The steel butt connected with the man's temple with a sickening crunch. The man collapsed without a sound, a crumpled heap on the bridge, before they could even catch their breath. A new sound reached them, the rumble of heavy wheels and the frantic pounding of a large team of horses. A heavy freight wagon, the same one they'd seen at the mine, burst from the darkness on the far bank, careening towards them. It wasn't a pursuit vehicle. It was a battering ram. "Jump!" Whit yelled. He slid from the saddle, pulling Nora with him. They hit the ground hard, rolling away just as the heavy wagon skidded onto the remaining part of the bridge, its iron-rimmed wheels screaming in protest. The driver fought the reins, trying to stop the heavy vehicle. It slid sideways, its immense weight threatening to tear the last supports of the bridge apart. The wheels churned through a patch of wet earth, flinging a spray of thick, red mud into the air. In the moonlight, the splattering clay looked exactly like blood. And then, on the far bank, illuminated by a lantern held by one of his men, a figure stepped forward. Reeve Caldwell. He stood perfectly still, watching the chaos he had orchestrated with an air of detached satisfaction. He looked across the ruined bridge, his voice carrying easily on the wind, cold and clear and sharp as glass. "Judge Harrow has given you 3 days. Landry," Caldwell called out, his voice devoid of all emotion. 3 days is more than enough time to burn a ranch to the ground. The threat was naked, absolute. It was a promise. Whit felt a blind rage surge through him. He started to scramble to his feet, his only thought to get back to dust, to somehow cross the chasm and get his hands on Caldwell. Whit. No. Nora's hand clamped onto his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "It's what they want. Don't fall for their trap." She was right. The horse, the fight, it was all a distraction. The real trap was his own anger. She pulled him back, away from the bridge, away from the taunting figure of Caldwell. They half ran, half stumbled to the edge of the steep arroyo bank. With no other choice, they tumbled over the side, sliding and falling down the loose, gravelly slope, landing in the deep shadows and tangled undergrowth at the bottom of the dry creek bed. Above them, they could hear the shouts of Caldwell's men, the nervous whinnying of horses. They pressed themselves into the cold earth, their bodies hidden by the thick darkness, and waited, their hearts pounding in unison. After a long while, the sounds from above began to fade. Caldwell, not wanting to risk his men in a blind search in the treacherous arroyo at night, had called them off. The hoofbeats receded, leaving behind an ringing silence. Slowly, cautiously, they rose. Nora went to the small trickle of water that still flowed in the center of the arroyo. She cupped the icy water in her hands and brought it to her face, rinsing the grit from her eyes and the drying blood from the thin cut on her cheek. The water was so cold it made her skin ache. She looked down. In the still pool at her feet, the blood-red moon was perfectly reflected as she washed away the stain of the fight. It was as if the crimson moonlight itself were cleansing the wound, a strange, chilling absolution in the wake of the night's violence. The flight from Arroyo Seco was a silent, desperate journey through a landscape of crimson-tinged shadows. They didn't stop until the blood moon had sunk below the horizon and the first pale, honest light of dawn began to sketch the eastern sky. They found dust waiting patiently where the trail to the broken spur forked, a silent, loyal sentinel. The ride back to Copper Bend was a heavy one. The weight of Caldwell's threat, a third passenger on the saddle. They had the proof, but they were trapped, with the marshal 2 days' ride away, and Caldwell's promise of fire hanging over them. News of the destroyed bridge and the nighttime chase must have traveled faster than they did. By the time they reached the edge of town, a boy was waiting for them, sent by Judge Harrow. She was calling an emergency session, not in her makeshift office at the market, but in the church, at dusk. As evening settled, the entire community of Copper Bend seemed to be drawn to the simple wooden building. They filed in not with the usual Sunday morning reverence, but with a tense, fearful silence. The air was thick with unspoken questions and a palpable sense of dread. There were no lamps lit. The only light came from dozens of candles placed in every corner and along the windowsills, their soft, flickering flames making the simple pine plank walls glow with the warm, rich color of honey. The light was gentle, intimate, turning the public hall of worship into a confessional. Judge Harrow stood at the front, not behind the pulpit, but beside it, a plain, formidable figure in the soft light. When the last person had found a seat in the crowded pews, she did not speak. She simply nodded to Reverend Ames. The Reverend, his face etched with a sorrow that seemed ancient, stepped forward holding a Bible, but he did not open it. He looked out at the faces of his congregation, at the ranchers, the miners, the blacksmith, the merchants, and all their wives and children. Before we discuss the events of this day, he began, his voice quiet but resonant in the hushed space. It is right that we remember. We remember the cost of living in this hard place. We remember the price that is paid for the riches pulled from the earth. He paused, and then he began to read from a list in his hand. Elijah Sims, lost in the shaft collapse of 79. Thomas O'Connell, crushed by a faulty timber brace. Jacob Miller, lung fever from the dust. Peter Schmidt, Carl Schmidt, brothers, killed in a blasting mishap. He continued on, his voice a steady, somber litany of loss. With each name, a fresh wave of silence, deeper and heavier than the last, fell over the church. A woman in the front pew, the widow of one of the Schmidt brothers, began to weep silently, her shoulders shaking. Her neighbor reached out and took her hand. All around the room, people who had borne their grief in private were now joined in a public, silent acknowledgement of their shared history of loss. These were not just names. They were husbands, sons, and brothers. They were the ghosts of Copper Bend, their lives exchanged for the coal and silver that made men like Reeve Caldwell rich. When the last name was read, the silence in the church was absolute. It was a silence as heavy and profound as the earth itself. It was into this silence that Whit Landry rose to his feet. The collective rustle of 100 turning heads was the only sound. He stood in the middle of the people who had whispered about him, judged him, and branded him with their suspicions for 3 long years. His face was pale in the candlelight, his knuckles white where he gripped the back of the pew in front of him. He looked at no one and everyone. His voice, when it came, was raw and uneven, the sound of a stone being dragged from the deepest part of a well. "The night of the fire," he began, the words tearing from his throat. "The night my brother, the night Eli died." He stopped, swallowing hard against a grief so thick it threatened to choke him. "Everyone knows, everyone talks, but you don't know the truth of it." His eyes scanned the blur of faces. "The truth is, I was scared." The admission, so simple and so stark, landed with the force of a physical blow. "I saw the flames, and I heard the sound, and for a moment, I didn't move. I just stood there. I was afraid." He took a ragged breath. I ran to the well for water, but it was just an excuse. I was running away from the fire, and I came back too late." He let the words hang in the air, a confession as heavy and immovable as a granite boulder. He had carried it alone for 1,000 nights, and now he had laid it at the feet of the town. He looked down at the floor, unable to bear their gazes, the full weight of their judgment, his own shame finally crushing him. He expected condemnation. He expected the whispers to finally have their victory. He felt a touch on his arm. He looked up. Nora was standing beside him. She had risen with him, a silent, unwavering presence. Her hand rested on his forearm, a small point of warmth and impossible strength. She wasn't looking at the crowd. She was looking at him. "Today," she said, her voice soft but carrying with perfect clarity in the silent church. "When that man fired his gun, when everyone else ran, you ran toward the danger." She gave his arm a slight, firm squeeze. "Today, you came back right on time. It was not a pardon. It was something more. It was an affirmation." She was not forgiving his past. She was validating his present. She was telling the town, and him, that the man he was today had redeemed the boy who had been afraid. A current passed between them, a silent understanding so powerful. It was a vow. In that moment, in the honeyed glow of the candlelight, the wall around Whit Landry, built of rumor and his own guilt, finally crumbled to dust. They left the church to a fine, misty rain that hung in the air like a veil. The meeting had ended with Judge Harrow's solemn promise to hold the ledger and protect it until the marshal arrived. On the church porch, under the shelter of the small overhang, the world felt quiet, muffled by the damp air. The emotional turmoil of the evening had left them both raw. In the soft darkness, away from the prying eyes of the town, the space between them hummed with an unspoken energy. Whit looked at Nora, at the way the dampness made her hair curl at her temples, at the faint, angry red line on her cheek from the splinter. He thought of her steadying hand on his arm, of her voice cutting through his shame. He moved, his body acting before his mind could form the words. He leaned in, his gaze dropping to her lips. It was a slow, inevitable motion, a magnet drawn to its pole. He saw her eyes widen slightly, her breath catch in her throat, and then he stopped. An inch from her lips, he hesitated. Nora looked up at him, and a sad, knowing half-smile touched her mouth. It was not a rejection. It was a gentle dose of reality. "When we're still running," she said, her voice a near whisper. "Don't make promises." The moment passed. The kiss, unfulfilled, hung between them. A fragile, beautiful thing. He straightened up, giving a slow nod of understanding. She was right. A kiss now would be a promise, a hope for a future they had not yet earned and might not survive to see. Instead, they turned their turbulent feelings into a plan. They were no longer just running. They were fighting back. They stood on that porch and divided the labor of their small war. Nora, with her quiet strength and the trust she had earned, would go to the miners' families. She would collect their stories, their grievances, their own evidence of Caldwell's long history of negligence and cruelty. She would build a case of testimony to support the hard evidence of the ledger. Whit's role was simpler, more primal. He would ride back to the broken spur. Caldwell's threat had been clear. Whit would become the guardian, the protector of his land and his herd. He would watch the fences, patrol the borders, and ensure that the next fire Caldwell promised would never be set. The next day, Caldwell showed his hand. He couldn't touch Whit, who was a ghost in the hills of his own ranch. So he went after Nora. He sent 3 of his brutish mine guards to the Golden Canary. They didn't draw weapons. Their intimidation was cruder. They stormed into the kitchen, kicking over Nora's neat stacks of bandages, knocking her bottles of medicine to the floor, their laughter echoing through the saloon as they harassed the few sick and injured people waiting for her care. But something had changed in Copper Bend. The fear that had kept people silent for so long was beginning to burn away, replaced by a slow burning anger. As the guards continued their campaign of petty tyranny, the kitchen door opened. It was Silas, the miner whose hand Nora had mended, and behind him was the blacksmith, and behind him were 3 more miners, their faces grim. They carried no weapons, only their own solid, physical presence. They stood in the doorway, blocking it. They said nothing. They just stood there. The guards, faced with this wall of silent, determined men, faltered. Their bluster evaporated. After a moment of tense standoff, they shoved their way past, muttering curses, and retreated from the saloon. For the first time, the people of the town had pushed back. They had formed a line and held it. Later that afternoon, as Nora was cleaning up the mess, a small, grimy hand tugged on her sleeve. It was Silas's youngest son, a boy of about 8 with wide, serious eyes. He said nothing, but pushed a folded, greasy piece of paper into her hand. He had found it. He whispered, in the pocket of his father's old work coat, a coat he hadn't worn since the accident that had nearly cost him his hand. Nora unfolded it. It was a pay voucher, dated 2 years prior, for hazard work. It was stained with oil and what looked like soot, and at the bottom, the authorization was signed with a familiar, arrogant flourish, "C. Reeve." Just as she was staring at the signature, a sound rolled across the town, the clear, resonant peal of the church bell. It was not the frantic, chaotic alarm of the fight. This was a slow, deliberate ringing. One clear note, then a pause, then another. It was Reverend Ames. It was a call. Not a call to worship, but a call to witness. It was a sound that seemed to be gathering the scattered fragments of the town's courage, calling them to step out of the shadows and into the light. Nora looked from the new piece of evidence in her hand to the window, toward the sound of the bell. Whit was out there, guarding a fence line, just as she was here, guarding the heart of their fight, and the kiss that they had not shared, the promise they had not made, hung between them. A fragile ribbon caught on the wind, connecting them across the miles, a silent testament to everything they were fighting for. The last of Judge Harrow's 3 days arrived with a sky the color of a faded bruise. A heavy, expectant quiet had settled over Copper Bend, the kind that precedes either a thunderstorm or a verdict. But as dusk fell, a different kind of energy began to build, defying the tension. Reverend Ames and the town's women had gone ahead with their plan for a small fair on the wide patch of ground between the church and the saloon, a last-ditch effort to raise funds for the clinic. It was a fragile, defiant bubble of light and life in the encroaching darkness. Lanterns were strung between posts, their warm, yellow glow pushing back the shadows and glinting off the brass instruments of a small, out-of-tune band, the air filled with the smells of roasting corn, sweet molasses cake, and the dusty scent of the earth. It was an act of communal hope, a refusal to let Reeve Caldwell's shadow extinguish the town's spirit entirely. Nora and Whit moved through this hopeful scene, each playing their part. Whit, his face grim but resolute, had brought a wagon load of straw from his ranch. He wasn't selling it for profit, but for pennies a bundle to the travelers and freighters passing through, with every coin going into the clinic's collection jar. It was a quiet, solid contribution. an act of a man reinvesting in the community that had for so long cast him out. He worked steadily, his movements economical, his presence a silent, watchful anchor. Nora, meanwhile, had set up a small table under a lantern. A hand-painted sign propped against it, medical consultations, free of charge. It was a canny move. People who were too proud or too poor to seek her out at the saloon came to her now under the guise of the festive atmosphere. She lanced a boil for a young drover, checked the breathing of a miner's wheezing child, and gave advice on poultices to a rancher's wife, her calm voice and steady hands a source of profound comfort. She was weaving herself into the very fabric of the town, stitch by careful stitch. Reeve Caldwell was there, of course. He stood on the porch of the land office, observing the fair with a proprietary air, as if watching peasants frolic on his estate. He was flanked by his usual pair of thugs, his confidence a palpable, chilling force. He was waiting for the marshal, waiting for his paperwork to suffocate the town's fledgling rebellion. The moment came just as the band was taking a break. The central square fell into a relative quiet, filled only with the murmur of conversation and the laughter of children. Nora left her table and walked to the center of the square. She stood on a sturdy wooden crate that had held apples, her small figure drawing the eyes of everyone present. Whit stopped his work, his pitchfork held forgotten in his hands, his gaze locked on her. Nora took a deep breath. She did not shout. Her voice, when it came, was clear and carried the authority of a physician in an operating theater. "I want to thank you all for coming," she began. "What we are doing here tonight is building something, but before we can build, we have to clear the rotten timber." She gestured, and Silas the miner, his newly healed hand no longer bandaged, stepped forward with another man. They were carrying something heavy, covered by a dirty canvas tarp. They placed it on the ground at the foot of her crate, with a single, dramatic pull. Nora ripped the tarp away. There, stark in the lantern light, was the evidence from the raiders' camp, the barrel, still smelling faintly of kerosene, the long, sharp-toothed saw, the cruel steel trap, and resting on top of it all, the leather-bound payroll ledger. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Nora picked up one of the lanterns from its post and held it high, its light casting long, dancing shadows. The light caught the gleam of oil on the barrel, the sharp points of the saw's teeth, the cold, hard lines of the trap. "These are the tools Reeve Caldwell uses to build his empire," she declared, her voice ringing with a cold, righteous anger. "He pays men to cut fences, to set traps that maim livestock, to create hardship and fear. He drives down the value of your land so he can buy it for pennies. It is all recorded here." She tapped the ledger with her finger. "A book of wages for services rendered, the service of ruining his neighbors." From his porch, Caldwell laughed. A short, dismissive bark, the word of a hysterical woman and a cursed man, based on stolen property. "It's meaningless." "Is it?" Nora's voice cut back, sharp as a scalpel. She looked out into the crowd, her eyes finding a specific face. "Mr. Abernathy, your prize bull broke its leg last spring in a trap you never saw set. Is that meaningless?" She turned. "Mrs. Schmidt, a fire destroyed your hayrick just a week before Caldwell made you an offer on your land. Was that meaningless then?" A figure detached himself from the crowd and began to walk toward the light. It was a miner, a man with a face like a collapsed tunnel, all hollows and shadows. He stopped beside the evidence, his hands twisting the brim of his worn hat. "She's telling the truth," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "I was there. Caldwell's foreman. A man named Pike. He paid me and 2 others. He paid us to cut Landry's fence." The man looked at Whit, a mixture of shame and defiance in his eyes. "He told us Landry was bad luck, that he was dragging the whole valley down. Said it was for the best." Another man stepped forward, older, his back bent from years in the mines. "I set the traps," he confessed, his voice cracking. "Pike said they were for wolves, but he showed me where to put them. Always on the land of folks who'd refused to sell to Mr. Caldwell. He said he was just adjusting land values." Caldwell's face had become a thunderous mask. He strode down from the porch, pushing his way through the crowd that now shrank away from him. Lies, all of it, he roared, his composure finally cracking. He jabbed a finger toward the church, where Judge Harrow had just appeared. Drawn by the commotion, "Your Honor, my papers are in order. My deeds are legal. That is all that matters." Judge Harrow walked slowly into the center of the square, her gaze moving from Caldwell's furious face to the damning evidence, to the faces of the miners. She stopped before Caldwell, her expression as hard and unyielding as granite. "Paper is a fragile thing. Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice low and steady. "It can't stop a bullet, and it can't cover a fire." The crowd was a low, rumbling beast, its anger finally finding its voice. They began to press forward, a human tide of resentment. Nora, her moment finally at hand, picked up the ledger. She looked directly at Reeve Caldwell, her gray eyes blazing with a fire that eclipsed all the lanterns in the square. All the fear, all the running, all the quiet patience had been honed to this single, sharp point in time. "No more waiting," she said, the words a quiet vow that seemed to shake the very ground. From her medical bag, she produced her nurse's seal, a small brass stamp, and an ink pad. She opened the ledger to the first page, to Caldwell's arrogant signature. She pressed the seal firmly onto the ink pad, then brought it down onto the paper with a sharp, definitive thump. She had marked it, claimed it, not just as evidence, but as a symptom of a sickness she was here to cure. She did the same to the receipt from the boy, and to a sworn statement she had taken from the miners. Each thump of the seal was a nail being driven into the coffin of Caldwell's reign. The crowd erupted. It was a roar of liberation, a sound of chains breaking. And in that roar, a new sound emerged. A single voice, then another, then a dozen, chanting a name, Landry, Landry, Landry. The men and women who had whispered behind his back, who had shunned him and called him cursed, were now shouting his name in a chorus of support and redemption. Judge Harrow raised her hand for silence. "Based on this evidence and on this testimony," she announced, her voice ringing with judicial finality, "I am issuing a warrant for the immediate search of Reeve Caldwell's mining office and his warehouse at the edge of town." She looked at the town's 2 serving deputies, who had been watching, paralyzed with indecision. "Serve it, now. Seize all ledgers, all payroll books, everything." For a moment, the deputies hesitated, their ingrained fear of Caldwell warring with their duty. Then, spurred by the roar of the crowd, they moved, their expressions grimly determined. They were no longer Caldwell's men. They were the town's. Caldwell saw it was over. His face went pale. In the confusion, as the deputies pushed past him, he began to back away, trying to slip into the shadows at the edge of the square. His gunman, the same cold-eyed stranger from the cattle market, saw his employer's retreat. To create a diversion, he drew his pistol and fired a single, wild shot straight into the air. Panic erupted. The crowd surged backward. The gunman, seeing his chance, lowered his aim and fired again, this time into the scattering throng of people. Whit had been moving toward Nora the whole time. He saw the flash of the gun, saw the barrel swing in her direction. He didn't think. He reacted. He threw himself in front of her, his body a shield. Just as the pistol cracked again, he felt a searing, tearing pain high on his right shoulder as the bullet ripped through the thick fabric of his duster and grazed the flesh beneath. The impact spun him around, and he crashed to the ground, taking Nora with him. The gunman tried to raise his pistol for another shot, but he was overwhelmed. A wave of enraged miners and ranchers surged forward, burying him under a pile of fists and fury. In the sudden, shocked silence that followed, Nora was on her knees beside Whit. "You're hit," she cried, her voice tight with fear. "It's nothing," he grunted, trying to sit up. "Just a scratch." She ignored him, her hands already at his shoulder, tearing away the ripped and smoking fabric of his coat. The bullet had torn through the same spot as his old scar. She pulled her handkerchief, the one with the small, embroidered N. Dane, from her pocket, and pressed it hard against the bleeding wound. For a second, her hand trembled, the clean white linen a stark contrast to the chaos and the blood. Then, her resolve returned. Her fingers grew steady, her pressure firm and professional. She was a healer again, her fear mastered by her purpose. Slowly, as if in a dream, the world began to come back into focus. The dust, kicked up by 100 panicked feet, began to settle. The sun was beginning to rise, a clean, hopeful line of gold on the horizon. And through the lingering haze, a sound cut through the murmurs of the crowd and the groans of the injured. It was the sound of children who had been hidden away during the confrontation, emerging into the new day. It was the sound of their laughter, clear and bright and utterly fearless, a sound that finally, definitively, tore the last shreds of the Landry curse to pieces. The weeks that followed the fair were like the slow, deep breath a body takes after a long and desperate fever has broken. The noise and violence gave way to a quiet, steady rhythm of consequence and rebuilding. Reeve Caldwell, stripped of his power and allies, was taken by the territorial marshal to stand trial, his name already becoming a cautionary tale told in hushed tones. The Copper Bend Bank was placed under the temporary stewardship of a man from the territorial capital, a quiet, bespectacled man who promptly went through the ledgers and adjusted the predatory interest rates Caldwell had used to bleed the ranchers dry. The air in town, for the first time in years, felt clean and still. For Nora, the days were a blur of practical work. Her makeshift clinic at the Golden Canary was overwhelmed, not with victims of violence, but with the ordinary ailments the town had long neglected. She treated minors' coughs, set children's broken bones, and stitched up the everyday cuts and scrapes of frontier life. She was no longer an outsider. She was a vital organ in the town's newly healing body. One afternoon, the stagecoach brought the mail, and with it, a thick, expensive-looking envelope for her. It bore the crest of the Union Pacific Railroad. Inside, on heavy cream-colored paper, was a letter. It spoke in glowing terms of her courage and competence, reports of which had apparently traveled up the line. It offered her a position as the chief nursing officer on a brand-new medical train being outfitted for the Northern Spur Line, the most ambitious railway expansion in the territory. The salary was more than she had ever dreamed of, the opportunity immense. It was a long road. The letter concluded, but a chance to bring modern medicine to the farthest reaches of the frontier. She read the letter 3 times, the heavy paper cool and solid in her hands. It was everything she had ever worked for. It was a validation of her skills, a path forward, a future of purpose and respect. It was a ticket out of the dust and struggle of small, forgotten places like Copper Bend. She folded the letter and tucked it into her apron pocket, where its crisp edges pressed against her hip all afternoon. A constant, weighty reminder of a crossroad. That evening, she rode out to the broken spur. She found Whit not on his porch, but standing in the skeletal ruins of the old barn. The setting sun cast long, golden rays through the charred timbers, making them look like the ribs of some great, fallen beast. He had been working, clearing away the debris of his past, one scorched plank at a time. He stopped when he saw her, wiping a smear of soot from his forehead with the back of his hand. He looked tired, but the haunted, shadowed look was gone from his eyes. He looked like a man at peace with his ghosts. They didn't speak for a long time. They just stood together in the ruins, the silence between them comfortable, the air smelling of old ash and new earth. Finally, Nora pulled the letter from her pocket. "The railroad made me an offer," she said quietly, handing it to him. Whit took it, his hands rough and dirty against the fine paper. He read it slowly, his lips moving slightly with the words. She watched his face, searching for a sign, a flicker of disappointment or relief, but his expression was unreadable, carved from the same patient stone as the mountains around them. He read it all the way to the end, then folded it neatly along its original creases and handed it back to her. "It's a good offer," he said, his voice a low, neutral rumble. "A great one. Yes, she said. The single word felt small and inadequate. He turned and looked at the ruin around them, at the empty space where a barn had once stood, where a life had been lost. He looked at the vast, open sky, and then his gaze came back to her, clear and direct and stripped of all pretense. He took off his hat, holding it in his hands. It was the gesture of a man about to speak a solemn truth. "Stay," he said. The word was not a plea. It was a statement, as solid and unadorned as a block of granite. "Stay here, with me." He took a breath, his eyes never leaving hers. "We could build it, right here, where the old barn stood, a proper clinic, a place for you to work. And—" he hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes for the first time. "We could build a shelf for books, a lending library, for the folks who ride the long trails, for the children." The vision was so simple, so beautiful. It made her heart ache. A clinic and a library, rising from the ashes of a tragedy, a place of healing and knowledge. It was a future she had never dared to imagine, but a cold knot of fear tightened in her chest. The old fear of a woman who had fought so hard for her own place in the world. "And what would I be?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The rancher's wife who tends to his scrapes, another shadow behind a good man." Whit's face softened with a look of such profound understanding that it took her breath away. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy, old-fashioned iron key. It was dark with age and use. He held it out to her, placing it in the palm of her hand. The metal was cool and heavy, a tangible weight of trust. "This is the key to the granary," he said. "It's the only building on this ranch besides the cabin that didn't burn. It's where I keep the seed grain. The future." He closed her fingers over the key. "You wouldn't be a shadow, Nora. You'd be a partner, co-owner." The words settled between them. Co-owner. Not a wife, not a helper, not a companion, a partner. He wasn't offering her a place in his life. He was offering to build a new life with her name on the deed. The next days were the answer to every question. They did not talk about the future again. They began to build it. They started with the burned-out barn. The work was hard, back-breaking labor. They shoveled away the layers of ash, a task that felt like an archaeological dig into Whit's own grief. They pulled down the dangerously loose timbers, their hands becoming black with soot. They swept away the thick, ghostly cobwebs that had claimed the ruins. The air filled with the smell of damp, charred wood, of dust, and of the clean, sharp scent of the linseed oil they used to treat the salvaged planks that were still sound. They worked in a comfortable, syncopated rhythm. There was little need for words. He would pry a heavy beam loose, and she would be there to help him drag it away. She would point to a section that needed clearing, and he would begin to work. It was a partnership of sweat and shared purpose. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch of his cabin, too tired to speak, their hands raw, their muscles aching, and watch the stars appear in the clear desert sky, a profound sense of peace settling over them. And as they worked, the world around them began to heal, too. The first of the season's calves were born, small, wobbly creatures that were a promise of a good year. The late rains had been kind, and the grass in the pastures was growing thick and green. The payment on the banknote, once a looming executioner's axe, was now a manageable debt. The ranch, like its owner, was coming back to life. One afternoon, the miners who had testified at the fair rode out to the ranch. They came not as petitioners, but as equals. Whit met them by the corral and, without ceremony, paid them a full week's wages from his own pocket for the time they had lost by speaking out. It was a debt of honor, and he paid it gladly. The men took the money, their faces solemn. Then their leader, the man who had first confessed to cutting the fence, turned to the wagon they had brought. He lifted out a rough, hand-fired brick, its surface imperfect but solid. "We heard you were building," he said, placing the brick on a fence post, one by one. The other miners did the same, each adding another brick to the growing pile. It was not a payment. It was a gift. They were the first stones of the new foundation, a testament from a community that was learning to build together instead of tearing itself apart. That evening, Nora sat alone in her room above the Golden Canary. The sounds of the saloon below were a familiar, distant murmur. She took out a clean sheet of paper, her bottle of ink, and her pen. She looked at the railroad's letter, at its promise of a grand future, of prestige and travel. Then she looked out her window at the lights of Copper Bend, at the small, stubborn town that had fought its way back from the brink. She dipped her pen in the ink. She wrote a short, polite, and unequivocal letter to the Union Pacific Railroad, declining their generous offer. She wrote that her work in Copper Bend was not yet finished. She signed her name, and then, with a final, deliberate motion, she placed a period at the end of the sentence. The small black dot of ink on the page was as final and resonant as the closing note of a beautiful piece of music. The next day, she took the letter out to the broken spur. She found Whit mending a harness on the porch, his large hands surprisingly deft with the needle and all. She didn't say anything. She just handed him the letter she had written. He put down his work and took it. He read it with a slow, careful intensity, his brow furrowed in concentration. He read it as if it were not a simple letter, but a sacred oath, the words a binding promise that he was committing to memory. When he was finished, he looked up at her, and in his eyes, she saw a look of such profound gratitude and quiet joy that it made her own heart feel impossibly full. He folded the letter and handed it back to her. He stood up, and together they walked over to the cleared space where the barn had been. The ground was swept clean. The salvaged timbers were stacked neatly, and the pile of bricks from the miners stood like a small, hopeful monument. They stood there on the threshold of their future, not touching, but connected by a current of shared understanding that was stronger than any physical bond. The sun was warm on their faces, and the breeze carried the clean scent of sage and newly turned earth. Their four hands, calloused and covered in the fine, gray dust of their labor, hung at their sides, as warm and steady as the embers in a winter hearth. The structure that rose from the ashes of the old barn was not grand, but it was solid, honest, and smelled of new-sawn pine and determination. It was long and low, with a wide porch and windows big enough to let in the generous desert light. A small, brass bell, salvaged from an old schoolhouse, hung by the new front door. And on the first day they opened to the public, that bell did not chime. It clanged, a bright, clear summons pulled by an eager young hand. The children of Copper Bend, who had for so long lived with the ambient dust of the mines and the quiet anxieties of their parents, spilled through the door like a joyful, chaotic flood. They came not for medicine, but for the novelty, the wonder of a new place that was theirs. Their hands were stained with the cheap ink from their school slates, and their knees were caked with the rich, red mud from the creek bed. They tracked this vibrant, messy evidence of their lives across the new floorboards that Nora and Whit had spent a week sanding and oiling until they shone. Nora didn't mind. She saw the tracks not as dirt, but as the first lines of a new story being written in this place, while she was inside, showing a young girl how to properly bandage her doll's imaginary wound. Whit was outside, hanging the sign. He had carved it himself over many nights by lamplight, the letters deep and sure. He had painted them a stark, clean black against the pale wood. He lifted it and hung it from 2 iron hooks he had forged himself. The sign swung slightly in the breeze, its words a simple declaration of a shared dream: Red Plateau Clinic Lending Shelf. It was a name that bound the earth, the body, and the mind together. A place for healing, and a place for stories. A shelf for the lonely horsemen and drovers to borrow a book. A promise that no one had to be entirely alone on the long, quiet trails. Later that afternoon, after the last child had been sent home with a promise of more books to come, a quiet settled over the new building. The air inside was still and warm, filled with the lingering sense of the day, the chalky smell of new plaster, the sharp tang of the carbolic acid Nora used to clean, and the faint, sweet perfume of the wildflowers one of the miners' wives had brought as a gift. Nora found Whit on the porch, watching the first of his new calves kicking up their heels in the pasture. She was holding a small, neatly folded square of white linen. She held it out to him. It was her handkerchief. He took it, his big, calloused hands gentle with the delicate fabric. He saw that it was not the same as it had been. The small tear from the night of the fair, where her frantic hands had clutched it, had been mended with a pattern of stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. The fabric itself, washed and bleached by the sun, was bright and clean. And in the corner, just below her original, elegant monogram, N.J., were 3 new words, embroidered in the same dark blue thread. The stitches were small, a little less perfect than the original letters, but they were sewn with a fierce, undeniable purpose. They read, "No more waiting." He ran his thumb over the new words, the raised thread a tangible reminder of their entire journey, from a dusty arroyo to this solid, peaceful porch. He looked up at her, his throat thick with emotions for which he had no words. The world seemed to pause, the wind died down, and in the sudden stillness, all the subtle sounds of the ranch seemed to grow louder, the contented lowing of the calves demanding their evening meal, the rustle of new grass in the pasture, the gentle creak of the new sign swinging on its hooks. The air itself seemed full, not with tension, but with the life. It smelled of the coming cool of the evening, of the clean, soapy scent that always clung to Nora's clothes, and of the faint, metallic tang of rusted tools that had been scrubbed clean and put back to work. Whit's eyes met Nora's. There was no hurry in his gaze, no desperate urgency. His breathing was slow and even, a match for her own. They stood there, 2 people grounded in a place they had built, their shared past a foundation, not a burden. A slow smile touched Nora's lips, a flash of the playful, defiant spirit he had first seen in her beside her broken wagon. "Are you going to pull me up on your saddle again?" she asked, her voice a low, gentle tease. Whit's own lips curved into a rare, genuine smile that transformed his rugged face, erasing the last of the shadows. He reached out, not to pull her, but to take her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. His grip was warm and solid. "We'll get up together this time," he answered, his voice a quiet promise. "It's time for work." And then he leaned in and kissed her. It was not the desperate, frantic kiss of a romance novel. It was like the handshake that seals a fair deal, or the final nail that secures a roof beam. It was short, firm, and full of the simple, unspoken certainty of repetition. It was a kiss that tasted of dust and soap and the promise of 1,000 more sunrises. It was not a magical solution, but a mutual agreement to face the labor of the coming days, together. As they stood on the porch, hand in hand, watching the sky turn a soft, dusky rose, a sound drifted on the evening air. It was the faint, lonely whistle of the train, miles away, making its steady progress across the plains. But the sound had changed. It was no longer a mournful cry of a world leaving Copper Bend behind. It was just a sound, a part of the landscape, a distant machine in a world that could no longer touch the quiet, solid peace they had built here. Copper Bend was no longer a town that bowed its head to rumors and shadows. The story they told in the town saloons and around the campfires began to change. Too, people stopped talking about the Landry curse. They started a new legend. They said that any curse, no matter how dark, would burn away like morning mist when the sun was finally allowed to shine. And they continued to choose each other, every day, with every sunrise. Their love was not a grand, sweeping passion, but a series of small, deliberate actions, the mending of a fence, the brewing of a pot of coffee, the lighting of a lamp. They built their life together, a quiet, steady rhythm set against the backdrop of the high desert, the lowing of cattle, and the clear, bright clang of a small clinic bell. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey into the Old West, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and support us further by hitting the hype button to help this story reach more listeners.